Welcome to the London Commercial Offices podcast with me, your host, Steve Berridge, Managing Director at Fidgens Cost Management. This is a podcast where we share the stories, career paths, lessons and insights from some of the industry's most influential people. Anything contained within our podcast should not be considered professional advice, and if you haven't done so already, please hit the subscribe or follow buttons to ensure you don't miss any of the amazing guests we've got coming up. It also really helps us grow the show. Thanks. Today we're joined by Sammy Kingston, Chief Operating Officer at Adeline Grantham, a family-owned real estate office spanning nearly a century over 4 generations. With a focus on long-term value-driven investments, they've been developing and investing in the central London office market for quite some time. So, without further ado, Sammy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's one of the best intros I've ever had, I think. Well, no, it's great to be here, and thank you very much for having me on. It's really great to be here.
No, my pleasure, and looking forward to it. So, look, you'll know from previous episodes that we'd like to start right back at the beginning. So how far are we going back today?
So I think we should probably go back to when I was about 16. And when I say 16, I'm sort of talking kind of GCSEs at school. I think that's a really important start in my career. And I think the reason that that's a really important start in my career, and I guess I'll come on to this, but I left school when I was 16 to start my career. But I think school was a really interesting time for me because I absolutely loved being at school. I loved being with my friends. And actually, I was quite smart, but never really put my mind to being at school.
You weren't interested in kind of academics, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I just, I always... As the classic case is with a lot of people, you really put your heart into things that you really quite enjoy. I was very sporty, always very good at PE at school. And, I was always like, first person on the team sheet on the school football team. And so, but when it came to sitting in a maths class and listening to someone, I was like, I really don't want to be here. It's interesting because I was never looking to leave school at 16. An opportunity presented itself to me. So that's why I think it's quite an interesting place to start. Yeah, I guess in the summer of my GCSEs, I had the opportunity to go and do some work experience at CBRE. For those who don't know who CBRE are, although I'm sure most of the listeners on this call will know.
I hope they do. If not, their marketing department needs to do some work.
The largest real estate advisory company in the world. So I got a really great opportunity to go and do some work experience there. During that work experience, I really enjoyed my 2 weeks there. And whilst I was there, someone kind of came up to me and said, we're about to kick off interviews for our first ever apprenticeship scheme in real estate. Would you like to interview for it? And it was kind of one of those weird things at 16. Someone says, do you want to interview for a job? And I was like, maybe, I don't know. I just about worked out how to like sit down for an hour and listen to someone in school, let alone go and work in a big company. I sort of went back to my parents that night and I said, I've been offered this really interesting opportunity, not to have a job, but to interview for one. So there was a high chance that I wouldn't even get the job in the first place. But it felt really interesting. And my dad, who has always been a really great mentor to me and works in real estate himself, said, why not? Just go and interview and go and meet them and see what it's like. You may not even get it, and therefore you might go and do your A-levels and just carry on at school and go to uni and carry on a traditional route. I went to interview, and after sort of an interview and a sort of practical day that they held, they then offered me a job on their first ever apprenticeship scheme, which was 12 apprentices from all different walks of life, all different types of backgrounds. And at the age of 16, I was the youngest apprentice that they had hired of that sort of cohort. Most of them were sort of 18 to sort of 22. But it felt like a really amazing opportunity to leave school and enter the world of work at a really young age.
And what was what discipline was the apprenticeship in? Or was it just a roaming across the various departments that CBRE had at that time?
Yeah, that's a really funny question.
T-boy.
I might come on to that later.
Okay.
It actually kind of works as to the rest of my career, how that all sort of panned out. Yeah, effectively, it was a 5-year apprenticeship scheme in which 1 day a week you would go to college. You would, in your first sort of 3 years, get BTEC and NVQ, and then you would go on to complete your apprenticeship and do your APC and be a chartered surveyor. And within that, it was very much every year you would rotate around the business, you would learn, you would go to the retail team and the valuation team and the offices team and the industrial team and, learn different parts of the business to really figure out where you wanted to end up. It was almost like an elongated graduate scheme in that sense. But what was really interesting is I ended up being at CBRE for 4.5 years and actually not completing my apprenticeship, which probably comes back to really not enjoying being at school. When someone said, right, you've now got to do this big dissertation and this big APC, I was like, right, I'm out. That's me done. It sort of didn't happen that way. But during my 4.5 years at CBRE, I started really fortunately in their London offices team. At the time, back in 2013, that team was just booming. It was the top team in the whole market. They had all the best instructions. They were leasing all the best offices. They had all the best people. It was such an amazing place to be. And I felt myself really learning so much. And I think it wasn't just that, but they sort of gave me the respect of, regardless the fact that I was 16 and had just come out of school, it was like, no, we get it. He's here to learn. He's here to, progress in his career. Let's really give him stuff that he can go out and get his teeth stuck into, I guess. When the first year finished and they said, you now have to rotate, I sort of tried to convince my leasing team that I should stay in their team for another year, of which they agreed and said, okay, you can stay one more year, but at the end of that year, you are going to have to rotate into another team. But obviously after 2 years, then I was really bedded into that team and they'd had a couple of people leave. They didn't hire a graduate that year. So I was really their guy on the ground doing a lot of
valuable resource,
really valuable resource. Made such great relationships within that team. So after 2 years, I said, I don't want to rotate now. I'm really bedded into this team, and they actually wanted to keep me at the same time. So I stayed for a third year, and then, funnily enough, if no one's picked up where the story's going, I then stayed for a fourth year. So I ended up being in that team throughout pretty much my whole career at CBRE. After 4 years, they then said, right, you are now going to actually have to rotate and go to valuation and do your APC. And I spent 6 months in valuation, and 4 months into my role there, I was offered a job to move. It probably came at a really good time and a really bad time in a sort of strange way, I think, because looking back, I don't regret not doing my APC. I think everything happens for a reason. The place I've ended up now, I may not have been here had I have done that and maybe stayed at CBRE. Who knows? I was offered a job to go to a niche investment agency at the time, and I was 20, just coming on to 21 years old, and I was at that stage in my career where all my friends were at uni. I'd been working for 5 years, and I was probably arguably way too arrogant for my age at the time and my I say expertise in parentheses.
I think part of that is an age thing. I think and I can relate to that, as a 16 to 21 year old, you still got a hell of a lot of growing up to do. You don't think it at the time.
100%. 100%.
And I can look back to me as a graduate QS at 21 in office fit out. Again, Davis Langdon, blue chip, creme de la creme, some of the best fit outs in town. And thinking, well, yeah, I've done it. I'm here. I know what I'm doing now. And in reality, I say it's like passing a driving test. You've learned to pass your driving test. That doesn't mean you know how to drive. That means you know how to drive for a test.
100%.
And it's, I think, but that, I'd say it's kind of par for the course, I think, for a 20-year-old boy that's been earning income, for 5 years, and his friends probably haven't.
Yeah. So it was all of those things put together. I thought, yeah, I can go and work for a niche company, and I can go and make more money, and I can go and, find my way in the world after being at the big green machine for 5 years. But what I will say, looking back, and I say this to everyone, my time at CBRE was truly, truly amazing. I loved the people there. I loved working in Henrietta House in their big office in the West End. I felt a real sense of, I don't know what the word is, but sort of really being proud of myself that I could walk into that office every day and be there. I accomplished some amazing things at CBRE. I set up a network for apprentices during my time there, which, looking back is one of the best things that I've ever done. And it was set up with me and one of the other apprentices at the time, because we hadn't come out of university, we hadn't been on a graduate scheme, we had no network of people our own age and people who had been through the same experience as us. And as CBRE started their apprenticeship scheme, more and more companies started to do it. So I think it was in our third year of being at CBRE, we set up this thing called the Apprentice Network. At the time, apprenticeships in real estate was such a big thing because they were so fresh and so new in the world that people wanted to put money into it and they wanted to support it. So it was crazy. I was 18 years old, sitting with the CEO or the managing director of JLL or Savills, or in this case, CBRE, when it was Kieran Bird, basically saying, will you support this? Will you give us tens of thousands of pounds to go out and basically create this network and host events and put on amazing events for people who are at our stage in our career? And they all supported it. They all wanted to do it. They were all super supportive of it. A year into it, we'd hosted 4 events. We'd brought together probably 200 apprentices in mostly real estate, but we had some law apprentices and some others who were kind of linked to property in some way. I then went on to win a Property Week award, the Young Property Personality of the Year, in 2015, I think it was, or 2016.
To further pat that ego on the back.
Yeah, exactly. So I was like the youngest ever winner of the Property Week award. I probably still am to this day. So, sort of circling back to then leaving CBRE, it was, I don't want to say I was the poster boy because that's definitely not correct. But, I had been this guy who was in their London team and had done really well and had won a Property Week award and set up this Apprentice Network. And, I think when I handed in my notice, it wasn't taken particularly well because they really felt that they supported me throughout.
Invested in you.
Yeah, which looking back, they had, and they weren't wrong to think that way. But at the same time, I thought I want to go and earn more and do more and be a bit more entrepreneurial with my career. But then I stepped into a 4-person niche investment agency, and suddenly all of these great things that had surrounded me at CBRE, a research team, a retail team, people that I could talk to, and loads of buzz and people around me in a big office, well, suddenly overnight that's all gone. And you've really got to
Humbling.
Yeah, you've really got to rethink of, right, what do I do now if I need a piece of advice or I need to speak to someone or I need, it's like I was really on my own. And of course, I worked with 3 other people who were really great and really supportive at the time. But it was totally different. It was chalk and cheese as to, those 2 jobs.
And I can imagine, when you were at CBRE, there's an awful lot of deal flow that comes through you because you are part of CBRE. You're part of a bigger machine. There's that many cogs turning that there's that constant deal cycle. Whereas if you're leaving, you're joining a much smaller team, suddenly that rug's been pulled out from underneath your feet.
100%. Again, as I say, in those first sort of 6 months of moving job, they were really supportive, but there was still an understanding of, well, we've hired you, so you've got to start billing, you've got to start making money for us. Otherwise, what's the point of you being here? And I guess in a strange way, my first deal at that company happened in July, having been there for 7 months. And I went and acted on behalf of a private property company, buying them an industrial estate for £23 million, which was a huge deal at the time. So I was like, maybe this is actually, maybe I can do this, but I really had to work really hard to get to that point. I knew that I had to go out and meet loads of agents and meet loads of different people and just be really unapologetic about how I was in that business. But it was, I had such a great time there. But, things changed in that business. They hired a few more people. I sort of started to find myself in this kind of strange situation whereby I actually started to realize in my head, I probably do need more assistance and I need more help. And I'm still so young in my career. Okay, my career had spanned, sort of 6 years by that point, but that's really young. And I was 23 years old. Most of my friends were just coming out of uni trying to find a job. But even still, there were certain life experiences and things that I didn't have. And I felt at the time that I still needed more support. It was really interesting. And this is going to be a theme throughout, I guess, this whole podcast, in which relationships become really important. And I think everyone knows that. And that's a really cliche thing to say. A lot of the jobs that I've sort of moved to throughout my career have all been through relationships, and in a strange way have often been through CBRE relationships. The next job that I then went to after the investment agency was a company called VTS, I took a total leap and went to join a real estate technology business.
Had you had any sort of interest or, foray into technology before that, or this was a real?
I think there was always a real interest in the sense that, I was young, I was really embracing of technology. I definitely had always felt that something had to change within real estate. I used to really see how other industries were, even to the simplest point of, if you go and buy a car, what's the first thing you do? You go online, you look at the car, you probably watch a video of the car, you probably go on YouTube. Like, everything was so digital of how things were procured, but property had never kind of caught up to those other industries, especially back then. It's much better now. I'd argue that they're still behind, actually, but certainly back then, and I was in office leasing, but I remember being at CBRE, having to print out property particulars to take on a viewing, to then hand to people. And, the way that they found that was through people. They appointed an agent, the agent found a property, the agent contacted me. It was all through phone and email. And, there was never anything to go online and have a look at things, or even, from a landlord perspective, it was like, well, how are you managing your property? You own 10 buildings. Where's all of that information hosted? It's probably on an Excel spreadsheet, which you've owned for 20 years, which has probably changed over time. There's probably
riddled with errors.
Yeah, 100%.
I'm completely on board with that. I'm a QS. I love Excel for obvious reasons, but it's been over leveraged over the last decade to kind of fill all of the gaps where a solution doesn't exist. And it was someone told me once that if you've got a spreadsheet that more than one person needs to use, then it's not fit for purpose. and actually now, if I think, there's a few things that I'm working on in parallel to this that relate to that, in terms of, whether that's manual tender interview score sheets or, interim valuations to a certain degree. It's the easy option because, 99% of the market know how to use it and they trust it, but it's very limited in terms of what it can do. So I completely get that.
100%. And obviously at the time, we didn't have AI, we didn't have any of those things. But there was a real interest in how were things changing, or how could things change in a really positive way. Coming back to my relationships at CBRE, one of my old colleagues in the office leasing team, and he won't mind me saying this, Luke Armstrong, who's now one of the top dogs at WeWork, he had left CBRE about when was it? Probably about a year before I left to join this company called VTS. He actually wasn't there long because he then went and joined WeWork, where he's been ever since. But there was a few people who worked for VTS who I knew really well. They were sort of in their infancy in London. They were
so for people that don't know VTS, in terms of what they are as a software company.
So VTS started out really, actually it's really interesting. So VTS stands for View the Space. And the way that they started out as a business, and I'm going back probably 10 years to when they started predominantly in the US. They started in the US and nothing was in London. They started out as a way for office brokers in the US, or leasing agents, as we would call them here, to view space online. That's how they started out as a business. That sort of progressed within their business because what they realized was it's all well and good going to see property, but how is that then being updated? How is the landlord keeping that information up to date? It's slowly becoming out of date. How do you run through the whole process once someone decides to lease that space? Well, how's that process managed? So they sort of flip everything and started with the landlords. And they said, coming back to my earlier point on Excel, this is how you currently do things. You manage everything on Excel. It sits on this horrible spreadsheet that's been live for 10 years, riddled with errors and God knows what. Let's take all of that great information. Let's put it into a system whereby everything is really clean to see. You can manage all your property. It will give you alerts on your breaks, on your expiries, on rent reviews coming up. And all that process can be managed in one place. So that's really where they started as a business. And it took off in the US. I mean, I'm talking crazy levels of adoption in specifically New York was really where they started. I mean, by the time that I'd left VTS, I think that there was a crazy stat of something like more than, I think it was 90-ish% of offices in New York, specifically in landlords, were using VTS to manage their real estate. Which, if you take the New York market, it's about 450 million square feet. So it's a crazy number.
It's a successful business.
It's a crazy number of buildings. So I joined when there was about 6-7 people in the UK team. They were about 3 years into their journey, but the adoption was much slower in the UK and specifically London.
Why do you think that was? Was that in terms of because there was more competition for those software platforms, or because as a culture in London we were still happy with Excel?
I think there's a few things. I think one, and this is just generally, I just don't think we like change. I think that was definitely the first thing, that people just don't like to change how they're currently doing things. And also the ownership in London specifically is way more fragmented than in New York. And actually, we did this piece of research when I was at VTS. So New York's market is about double London. So London is about 240 million square feet of offices, there or thereabouts. And New York's about 450, 460. In London, so we worked out that there were something like 100 different owners that owned 100 million square feet. So call it half of the London's office market. Now, obviously, you've got your big boys, Derwent, Landsec, British Land, who own significant amounts of real estate, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 million square feet. But even still, if you own, 10 million square feet, you don't really still own that much of London because it's 260 million square feet market. So whereas in New York, where you've got the likes of Tishman Speyer, who own 60 million square feet of the New York market, and there's, I think there's something like 10 owners in New York own 300 million square feet of New York. So if you sign up 10 landlords for VTS, you've got
50% of the market already.
Yeah, if not more, you're sort of 60% of the way there. Whereas, if you go and sign up the Crown Estate, British Land, Landsec, etc., and Derwent, suddenly actually you've only really got about 20%, if that, of the market. So way more fragmented, way more difficult, and you've got sole owners, you've got private families who own 1 or 2 buildings. It's a real different market to get a hold of. And by the time I left, they were actually at about 50%. So they'd done a really, really good job of the adoption in London. But I was at VTS for 3 and a bit years. I probably joined VTS at the perfect time and left at the perfect time. It was one of those amazing jobs and roles where everything kind of falls into place and everything just goes really well.
What was the job and the role that you jumped over to do? So obviously you were active leasing agent beforehand. What was it that you kind of jumped into? Presumably it wasn't leasing.
No, so I went to be in a sales role, so selling their technology into the landlords. And I think what was really interesting when I joined was they'd had quite a lot of technology people that had come in from other tech companies to sell the technology. They didn't speak the language of real estate. They were always saying to me, it's much easier to come in as a real estate person and learn how to sell technology rather than, knowing how to sell technology, but then really trying to understand real estate. Because if you're selling to the managing director of a family office or someone at the Crown Estate, you can talk to them on a real estate level, without really even needing to know why they might need a product or a technology product within their business. You can really start to understand things about their business that someone else may not understand. So I went in there as a salesperson. I joined in January 2020, which was 3 months before COVID. But it was amazing. I was there at a time where their marketing budgets were huge. They were throwing money at things. I was flown out to New York on my first day, went to a big conference, and all of these things were just, I'd never been a part of a business like that. It felt really fun, almost like a startup. We were 6, 7 people in the UK in a WeWork office in Soho. It was really that the energy every day that you walked into work was just something really quite special, and it felt like we were building something. It really did feel like that. And because I was sort of one of the first into the UK team, it meant that I was really close to people in the US and the founders who were really, really close to our business in the UK, and our CFO and all of these different people in the US that people who joined later to the UK team never really had that kind of relationship with other people in the US. So I had such a great time there learning really new things about people's business, because to sell the product, you really had to understand, how do you work as a business today? How do you do things? What are your processes?
Pain points.
What are your all of those things that, as a leasing agent or an investment agent, you wouldn't really care in the nicest way possible, but you just would never find out those things. So I got to talk to a lot of these people that I'd known before from leasing or investment, but talk to them on a real different level of how I'd spoken to them before. So it was just such a fun and interesting time in my career. And then I guess moving on, I think as I went through my career at VTS, I definitely felt towards the end that something was missing. I think at the time VTS had started, in my last sort of 6 months as a business, they'd reached crazy heights. They became a unicorn. They were a unicorn business, $1 billion valuation. As I say, when I joined, we were 6 people in the UK. There was about 150 in the US. When I left, the company was 800 people globally in 3 years. So the level of growth and the level of change was so astronomical in that business. Towards me leaving, it became, obviously a very different business to the one that I had joined. It went from really exciting, very startup and let's do crazy and amazing things to
process driven, oversight.
We're now a really established business, and we need to do things not properly, but we need to do things differently to how we were once doing it.
Well, that's interesting. So you kind of started your career at a big beast, CBRE, which you then left to go to a really small startup. You then ended up at somewhere else small that became a big beast and then left again. So I'm wondering whether, do you feel like you fit better in smaller, more niche organizations? I mean, I think there's a part for both. I think learning the craft at someone like a CBRE or for me, a Davis Langdon is you can't get better, because they've got those training systems in place. They've had enough graduates or young people go through them that they know how to help them. But I know I'm biased far more towards smaller niche businesses.
100%. And I think it's a really personal thing, actually. I've got friends I've got a couple of friends now that work for CBRE that have been there 5-6 years. I had a friend that has just left after 12 years. People do stay there because the environment and the people and everything around you is so brilliant. Those places exist and they're hugely successful for a reason. And as I said earlier, I don't have a bad word to say about CBRE. It's an incredible business, as are a lot of the other corporates. So, I think for me, in all honesty, I don't think I belong in one of those businesses, because I think I'm a little bit more entrepreneurial. I think I'm a little bit more outside the box thinker. I also think I don't like huge amounts of process. I think I think process is okay. Anyone would probably tell you that knows me really well, actually, that I'm actually quite process driven in my life. I really think about things to a T. I'm always on time, if not early, to things. I'm really
slightly OCD.
like I'm really organized and
Agree.
I do. Even like when I book a holiday, I'm always thinking about and I'm sort of two ways. I can easily sunbathe on a beach for 8 hours, but if we're not doing that, I'm like, right, what are we doing? What times are we doing it? How are we getting there? Everything needs to be sorted out. I'm not just going to turn up and hope for the best. It has to be
structured,
really
planned,
structured,
organised.
But
I think for me, that's an efficiency thing. As in, I want to ensure I'm getting the most out of my time and my day. And that's because I'm very similar.
100%. I think that's right. But I think in business, I think there's only so much of that you can have, because I think if you're so process driven, you're going to continue on the same path for throughout your career. And I think actually it's okay to veer right or veer left throughout your career and do slightly different things. And
opportunities are in the weeds.
100%. And I think until you sort of let yourself go a little bit, and actually I don't think I was ever like this from probably quite a young age. I always wanted to be kind of different and not be so process driven in a career or when I was doing something like that. So yeah, I think generally speaking, I probably am a smaller business type of person where process is important, but I think I can still have that enough amount of freedom to really put my own stamp on things. And during my time at VTS, I was contacted, one of my old colleagues at CBRE that I used to work with, called Andrew Gibson, who, again, him and Luke, who I mentioned earlier, who's now at WeWork, they were sort of my two main mentors at CBRE. They were the people that I just took to straight away. All of our leasing instructions were sort of together, and we just struck up an amazing relationship, the three of us. And, they were obviously older than me at the time, but always had stayed in contact with them throughout different parts of my career. We sort of got chatting one day. He said, we're thinking about hiring someone into the business. And at the time, should have really mentioned this earlier. So he left CBRE to set up a business called Hedge Real Estate, which was a niche leasing business. They then merged with Contour, who a lot of people, again, might know, but again, relatively small leasing agents, were always acquisition based. They acquired the Hedge team to go in and be their disposal agents within Contour and merge as one and become a fuller Contour team. He said, do you want to get back into leasing? Is it something that you would think about? And I said, absolutely, yes. I know Contour really well. I know James Townsend, who's their CEO.
Who's coming on the pod in a couple of weeks, actually.
Ah, yes, I think he did mention that to me. So James, yeah. I mean, James is brilliant. Also used to work at CBRE, and don't want to ruin his own podcast, but James is such an amazing guy. So I've known James again for probably 12 years or so, and had known Andrew for sort of 10 years. And it was one of those times where it felt so natural to move into that job. Even having not done leasing really for 3 or 4 years, I knew I could pick it up really quickly. I knew that they'd have faith in me from day one. I knew they'd give me time to bed into the business.
Because presumably, had you kept your kind of network warm for the 3 years of VTS, because you were still in the space, but not on a deal level almost.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah. It was really hard. It was a really hard job to keep that kind of close network with people. Because whilst you are talking to people every day, predominantly landlords, really, it's, like you say, you're not there on a deal level talking to people every day and really, going out for a beer with someone at the end of the day. It was a very kind of different relationship. So it was really difficult, but I've always done pretty well at keeping relationships close to me and people that I know really well. I've always stayed in contact with people, and I think, when you do a good job for someone, it doesn't really matter how often you go for a beer with them or how often you speak to them. You'll always have that relationship kind of there in the background. And I think Gibbo or Andrew was definitely one of those people whereby we had such a good relationship in the first place that there was always kind of, and we always joked actually at CBRE, why don't we go and set up on our own? Or why don't, we're going to work together one day when I left or when he left. It was And actually, it then happened when I then joined Contour in 2023. And that I have to really say, I mean, being at Contour and my time got cut short in a weird way there, to now join where I am now. But Contour was such a brilliant business, and anyone who still works there, and I'm sure James will happily tell
I'm going to snippet some of this as a testimonial to use on James's episode.
You should do, honestly.
Yeah.
It's such a brilliant business, and actually, it's quite interesting that they're a small business. You know, when I was there were 20 odd people, and their acquisitions team, who've really that's been their core business for sort of 10 years before they merged and brought in a disposals team, are such a well-oiled machine for such a small business. You know, they're doing amazing deals with amazing clients. Most of them I probably can't even mention who they are, but unless James maybe tells you in a few weeks. I'll let him. I'll leave that to him. Though. Such a brilliant business, and then I knew coming into the disposal side of the business with again some really amazing people that I'd known for quite a long time. Nothing could really go wrong. I knew it was a really, I don't want to say safe,
steady, but
yeah, it was really steady. It was, you know, quite an important time in my career where actually I felt that it probably could be a job for 5-10 years. It probably could be somewhere that I get really comfortable at and grow my career and, you know, move to the top of the business. It really did feel like that when I joined. And, you know, none of that will be a secret to anyone at Contour or James or Gibbo. None of that would be a secret at all.
How old were you when you went into 2023?
So I was 26 when I joined Contour.
So still, you know, still a nipper as such,
yeah,
you know,
still,
albeit with a decade's worth of experience in the market, kind of.
You know, and I think that was, you know, the really interesting thing. I went in as an associate director to Contour, relatively senior, you know, with a lot of my own clients that I brought into the business with a really good background of 10 years in the real estate industry. So, like you say, still only 26. So it was, yeah, really a really interesting and amazing time. And, you know, certainly pretty much honestly until the day I left, I just loved every minute there. The team were just so good. We got to work with brilliant clients. You know, everyone there is just so friendly. The energy in that place is infectious. It's really infectious energy at Contour because people are constantly working with really exciting tenants or really exciting buildings or exciting landlords or whatever it might be. Someone's always doing something that you just want to hear about and want to know about. So it was such a great, I just loved every minute there. Again, I don't think James is necessarily going to bring up me in his podcast, but he'll tell you that when I handed in my notice, I said to him, you know, this is a really strange time because, you know, typically I think when you hand in your notice, you're kind of mentally left. You've sort of mentally gone and you probably knew about it weeks and months before, and you'd probably been interviewing or having conversations with people. And this was a really different situation. This was like, I'm handing in my notice, but I'm really quite upset to be leaving. So it was a really strange, and I really felt like I'd cut my time short there. I was only actually there for a year and a half, you know, so it was really sad when I left. But then I left to where I am now, which, you know, just presented me with just the most unique, amazing opportunity that, frankly, anyone, let alone age, experience, anything, could maybe ever be offered.
So do we want to just, so for everyone's benefit, do we want to just give sort of so it's Adeline Grantham is the family office that you joined.
Yes.
Do you want to just give a sort of a very brief sort of synopsis overview of that? And then we can talk about how you came about getting the opportunity that you've now got.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, the family office really are an unbelievably unique family office, maybe one of the most unique in the London market. They actually, so I'll go back to the late 1950s and early 60s, long before either you or me were born. the family going back all those years had an architectural practice and a building practice, and they used to build and design their buildings. So they built their own property, which they then subsequently owned after building and designing them. And the amazing thing is, some of them since have been sold off and moved on out the family, but three of the assets, actually, I should say, still are owned by the family today. And that's through, different family members passing away and moving on and all those sorts of things. But it's incredible. I walk into the office every day and we have in our office the original drawing and plans from 1959, 1960, 1961, when these buildings were built, that we still own as a family office today. So truly mind-blowing, truly, truly incredible. But yeah, the family office has really moved on kind of through the years, and the sort of people, I guess, in charge of the family today who are based abroad, they really wanted to bring the family into this kind of new modern world, I think, because, things have changed and the market's changed and there's so many different things to now think about that. And also, I think they were also thinking about the legacy of the family and how much longer does this go? And we probably need to bring someone in that's going to be with us for quite a long time, because the two employees that I work with have worked for the family for 30 odd years, both of them. So they know everything like the back of their hands, and they need, first of all, there's a lot going on. So they just needed another person, but they also wanted someone that knew the market really well, knew London really well, and could kind of come in and run the business day to day to kind of move it into that next phase of what it might be.
Steer the ship in the direction that the central London market's going.
Absolutely. So hopefully that gives a kind of good overview of what the family are. But I guess how it came around is I don't really think it's kind of that strange in a weird way, but I met them through someone sort of before my time at Contour. We'd sort of started speaking, and then they were a client at Contour as well. So Contour was leasing all of their office buildings in London. I then sort of got quite close to them through leasing their buildings and giving them advice.
As in the two guys that have been there for a long time.
Yeah, through the family itself. And then I actually acted for them in buying them another building last year, because I was still doing a little bit of investment at Contour. And I think that was really the pivotal moment of whereby I'd really spent a lot of time with them buying this other building, that we formed this really great relationship. Nothing really happened then. That was going back sort of last summer. But it sort of hit Christmas time and we got talking. The family were basically explaining to me that, all of those things that I've just mentioned, we want to bring the family into a new era, I guess. Things that need to change and things need to be renewed, and we need to probably bring someone young in, and I think those things really had to sort of move with the time. So we got chatting over months and months and months, and eventually this opportunity was presented to me of, would I like to come in and be the sort of, I don't want to say new face, that's a bad phrase, but ultimately be the person to steer the ship for the next, 10, 15, 20 years. And it really was put to me like that. It was, I remember when we had our first conversation and they said to me, if you don't want to be here longer than 5-10 years,
you're not the right
conversation over.
Yeah, you're not the right candidate.
Yeah, exactly. Because, they do work on trust and legacy and people being with them for a long time. So I think it really, for me, felt like it's, first of all, it's just so unique. And, I'm still only 28, so very, very young to be in this sort of role. And it's really interesting. I was listening to a podcast with Vince Simpson, who was talking about, I've forgotten the phrase, it's gone out my head. Imposter
syndrome.
Yes. And it's really funny because I've I've never really experienced imposter syndrome. I've always felt lucky to be in the positions that I have been in, and really fortunate to have the jobs that I've had and the experiences that I've had. But I don't think I've ever really felt imposter syndrome until the first day I moved into this job, when I felt it times 100, because I suddenly went from a London leasing agent and being at people's beck and call and doing viewings, and to suddenly sitting.
But it's quite a defined process, isn't it, leasing? It's, here's an opportunity. The outcomes are, yes, there's some variables in terms of, dates and times and rents, but the outcomes are known. It's going to go one of two ways.
100.
Where we are now, or where you are now, is especially with the brief that you've got, essentially, in the sense of, we want you here for 20 years and we want you to take this forward. That's it. That's your brief, to a certain degree. And I think, it would be arrogant to a certain degree to not have an element of imposter syndrome, especially as it's not something that you've done before. And I actually think imposter syndrome almost should be called growth, because I think imposter syndrome, and when you feel that, is where growth happens. Because it's very hard to grow when you're doing the same thing and you know all of the outcomes, because there's no real risk. I think don't get me wrong, it feels negative, internally when it's running through your mind, but actually the outcome of that, I think, is very positive.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of putting it. I remember my first 2 weeks in this job, and my brain hurt in the first 2 weeks. I had like a real sort of cognitive overload of just information. It was like nothing I've ever experienced in any job, in all honesty, because I was having to really learn things just instantly, and I was sitting in meetings and in rooms and, in types of meetings and rooms that I've just never, ever been in my whole career. I'll give you an example. We're doing a development in Mayfair, 15,000 square feet office building. I was saying to someone actually the other week, as a leasing agent, you only ever really talk to 3 or 4 different people in your line of work. Probably another agent, your landlord or your client, maybe a lawyer, and like your own colleagues. That's kind of your little network of people that you're only ever talking to. Suddenly I'm in a room with quantity surveyors, M&E consultants, project managers, contractors,
all looking at you for the answer,
and all looking at me for the answer and going, "Do you think that's okay, Sammy? Can you approve of that? Can you, is that okay? I'll send you." And I'm just like, I appreciate people can't see this because it's a podcast, but I've like got my hands on my head going, that was like genuinely my reaction. And my head's like pounding of, I've got to learn all of this. I've got to think about all of this different information. But I feel so blessed to be in this position, because there's, I love property. I love being in property, but this is really the first time where I've really, really appreciated how property works day to day, because I'm in it and I'm at every level of what is happening from start to finish. So, even on this development site, I'm seeing it from its very first point to, hopefully when it practically completes. And I'm seeing that on every building that we own, and it's truly amazing to be in that position. But, like you say, I've now got people coming to me for answers and people wanting information from me that, sometimes I can't provide, or sometimes I don't even know the answer. Or so it's a huge learning curve. And my dad said to me when I joined this job, your learning curve is going to be more than steep and basically straight up. That's how it's going to be for certainly the next 6 to 9 months, but probably even longer than that. It's a job where I'm just going to be continue learning every day. And it really has felt that way, and it really has felt like that. But I also appreciate how unique this role is, and frankly, just how lucky and fortunate I am to be in this position, at I kind of hate saying at my age, because I think I'm, I always used to like the football phrase when managers said, if you're good enough, you're old enough. When they used to throw 16-year-olds on the football pitch and they go, "Oh, he's too young to be playing in the Premier League." But, people used to say, like, if you're good enough, you're old enough. And I do believe that. I think people need a chance. And if you're never given that chance, you never know if you're good enough to do it. And I probably felt a bit of that throughout my whole career, actually, because I've always been, ever since probably being at Contour, actually, I was always the youngest employee everywhere I worked, at CBRE, at Harris Associates, and then at VTS. I was always their youngest employee, which was always such a weird. I actually quite liked it in a kind of strange way, because it meant I could really kind of not prove people wrong, but it meant that I could, start to gain respect a bit quicker when people realized, oh, actually, okay, fair play, he knows what he's doing and he can do it. This is a very strange situation whereby I'm now the youngest person in a meeting room, but I'm also probably the most respected and people want answers from me. So it's a very bizarre situation, but one that hopefully I'm grabbed by the horns and really taken to it. But I'm loving every minute of it. But it's a stressful job for sure. That goes without
I imagine that comes with, there is, a level of responsibility that you have now accepted. It's been going for 100 years. You're now responsible to ensure that it lasts another 100 years. And you're not just a number within a large organization anymore. Should that not go to plan, well, it's quite, it's on you to a certain degree. Yes, you have a team. Yes, you have your professionals, but as you just said, they're all looking at you. But I think all you can do is not take it lightly and give it your all.
100%. And that's, like you say, I've thrown myself into it because I think that's all you can do. And, I'm also well aware that I'm going to get things wrong and I'm not going to do everything right. And I'm okay with that. I've come to terms with that, because certainly when I was at CBRE or, when I was younger, I hated getting things wrong, and I hated the idea of not knowing what I was.
Answer.
Yeah, I hated the idea of almost like feeling embarrassed of not knowing what something is. But I think I've really learned that throughout my career, to actually go, I don't know. Or no, I have no idea, but I'll ask, I'll figure it out, I'll work it out, and I'll come back to you in a very short time scale. And I'm okay with that now. And I think that's quite a key place for me to be in my career, to be okay with that, because there's going to be so many different occasions in this job where that is going to be the case. But at the same time, I know that I also have to pick things up really quickly and, get to know things and our buildings and how things run, straight away. So yeah, it's a unique situation I'm in, but I'm loving every minute, in all honesty.
Yeah, listen, it's one that I'm now I know the story, and I know we spoke previously. I'm quite looking forward to watching it unfold, because I say it doesn't happen every day, and I say it's kind of something unique that you get to do. So in terms of then sort of bigger plans then for the family office, what's on your radar, if you can talk about it, what are you looking at for the next 12 months, 24 months, 5 year, 10 year? Where's your head at?
Yeah, it's we definitely have a plan, and I probably have to be relatively careful in what I say here, but
of course,
certainly the two things I can definitely talk about. So as I mentioned, we're doing a development in Mayfair, which is a building on Brick Street, around the corner from sort of Old Park Lane. That's a really, really exciting 15,000 square feet self-contained office. Funnily enough, and again, comes back to relationships, Contour are leasing that for us with their joint agents, Knight Frank. And that's just a really, really exciting project to be involved in. I'm on site once a week, seeing everything unfold in front of me. And it's going to be the most amazing, unique space. I put a LinkedIn post up not too long ago about our hoarding having just gone up at the space. So I'm really seeing things evolve there all the time. But that's taking up a lot of my time at the moment, given it's a live development. We're refurbishing a small building that we own in Covent Garden, which is on Maiden Lane, number 6, which is also our HQ. So we will sit on the 3rd floor, and then we'll have the 2nd and 1st floors to let in that building. Small, 700-800 square feet floors, which again, Contour will be leasing for us. I've given Contour some great shout outs here, so I hope James appreciates it in a few weeks.
He certainly had a nice warm up.
Yeah,
sort of, the audience are going to be waiting for his episode now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we own another building in Fitzrovia, which is just long let, and it continues to just sort of sit, collect good rent. We have a really great tenant in that building. And then, really our jewel in the crown is a building in Soho called Waverley House, which is 60,000 square feet, over 8 floors. That's just an amazing building. The family built it in 1961. As I mentioned earlier, there's always asset management going on there. We've just let a floor, and that's kind of an ongoing project. And, who knows what may happen with that building one day. It's yet to really be seen. And then I think on top of all of that, we're always open to look for more opportunities. We definitely want to grow our portfolio. We're definitely not going to go and buy 10 buildings in the next 2 years, but we might buy 1, we might buy 2.
And are you solely focused on sort of zone 1 commercial?
Yeah, I think really anything in the West End.
Okay.
Very, very focused in the West End. All of our holdings now are in the West End. So, that's our bread and butter. That's what we know well. And we want to buy good buildings with good income and good tenants, as everyone does. But yeah, we're definitely open to growing the portfolio. And then loads of other side projects that are happening. We've just, I say rebranded. I don't actually think we ever had a brand. And again, that's kind of part of bringing the company into this new sort of era and phase, about putting ourselves out there more and really showing the market and other people about who we are and what we do and what we own and all of those different things. So we've now got a brand. We are building a website. So that's going to hopefully be live very soon. And again, it's really just a place for people to go and understand who we are and what we own and what we do. No more than that, really. But, that's kind of other side projects that are sort of happening in the side. So lots going on all the time, which is really exciting, really, really exciting.
Fantastic. Well, I think it will be great to get you back on in, another 12 months or so, to find out about you personally and how you're sort of growing to meet that role, but also find out more about the family and what else you've got going on. So in terms of is it Brook Street, the one that's under development, when's that due to PC?
Brick Street, ICK, yeah. You know what? I keep saying that to people, and I realise I don't know if it's my pronunciation. People go, "Oh wow, you're in a building on Brook Street," and I go, "Oh no." But yeah, 10 Brick Street, which will hopefully PC Q2 next year.
Q2 next year. Okay, well look, I really enjoyed today. Thank you, Sammy, for coming on. If people want to sort of reach out and find out more, we'll put your LinkedIn sort of profile in the show notes, and then obviously you can Google Adeline Grantham website to follow shortly.
Yes.
Look, thanks ever so much for coming on. Speak again soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
If you have an office project on the horizon and will be preparing a budget for board approval, head to my website, www.steveberridge.com, where I have a collection of resources to help you formulate a robust project budget and give your project the best chance of being a success. Thanks.